React Magic. React Magic.
In this video, we're going to be talking about why you might not want to be putting all of your state into a global store in React. This is something I wanted to talk about because it seems to be a common question online. It seems to be something that people aren't too sure about or that they don't have a strong opinion about. And I think you should probably have a strong opinion about this and kind of think about what you're doing because it's an important part of state management. And state management is one of the most important skills for a front end dev. I've seen people ask online about it. I've seen people that seem like they're professionals working in the industry ask on Reddit, say something like, hey, we're trying to decide how we're going to manage state in our upcoming project. Should we be putting everything into a global store? It's also something that I've dealt with at work. I've had to pick up a project in my consulting job where the previous dev had sort of just put everything into a global store, didn't really use local state where I thought it made sense. And I've seen firsthand how that can affect the maintainability of a project. And spoiler alert, my strong opinion is that no, you should not be putting everything in your global store indiscriminately. You should be thinking about what should be going in a global store. And you should also understand that there are some advantages to using local state instead of using a global store. And after this video, if you disagree with me and think, hey, I do want to still keep putting everything into a global store, that's totally fine. I think everybody should make up their own opinions. But when making that decision, it's important to understand that there are definitely some advantages to using local state that you don't get with global state. And it's important to mention that I'm only talking about application state here. I am not talking about server state. Server state being the stuff that you fetch from a remote source, right? Server state is stuff that you get from your back end that you're showing to your user on the front end. That is server state. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about application state specifically. Application state is the state that only lives on your front end and doesn't live anywhere else. Also, just need to mention that this applies to every state management library. Doesn't matter if you're using Jotai, Zustin, doesn't matter if you're using Redux. All these concepts and ideas apply equally to every global state management library. They're all global state at the end of the day. So the first thing we got to talk about with global state versus local state is what is global state, what is local state. It doesn't matter which one you think is better if you don't know which one is which, right? So global state is accessible anywhere in the component tree. In fact, global state isn't really even tied to a specific component. That's a really important fact about global state is that it gets initialized when your app starts up and it doesn't get thrown away until your app closes down, right? It's not tied to the life cycle of any specific component, and every component can access any global state. That's what makes it global. Local state, on the other hand, is state that's only available in a small subsection of your component tree. It's tied to a specific component, so it gets created, it gets initialized when a certain component mounts for the first time, and then it gets thrown away when a component unmounts. It's only going to be accessible by a component and possibly its children. The children can access it if the parent component passes down the state as a prop. So that's what local and global state are. Now we can talk about some of the advantages. Advantage number one is that you get increased modularity. Local state is only accessible by a small part of the component tree. Like we said, that means any complexity related to that local state is contained within a small part of the component tree. Knowing that no components outside of this subsection that has access to the local state are able to mess with that local state means no other part of the app can break that local state. If something breaks, we know that it happened within this small subsection of the app because we have that guarantee that no other component can access the state, right? And if we want to extend that functionality, we don't have to worry about any changes we make leaking out into the rest of the app, breaking something in the rest of the app, right? So again, the complexity of local state is contained within a small subsection of the application. So that complexity, that state management can get more and more difficult to deal with, but it's still going to be contained within that small subsection of the app, and it won't be making the rest of the application harder to deal with. Global stores, on the other hand, are accessible anywhere. We make a change to a global store in one component, it can affect a completely unrelated component, right? And the completely unrelated component can make a change to the global store, which affects the component that we're thinking about right now. One component can make a change to the global store and it can affect a completely unrelated component. One component can break the global store and it can break a completely unrelated component. What I'm getting at is that we do not have a guarantee of where something went wrong if something does go wrong with the global store. With the local state, we have the guarantee because we know only a few components could have even operated on the state in the first place, right? So, in contrast to the local state, the global store can potentially have its complexity reach other parts of the application if wielded incorrectly. And I know with good global state design, you're only using it in like one feature of your app. So it should be easy to tell where that global store is being used, but that's just more overhead, right? With the local state, you don't even have to think about that stuff. You know that it's only going to be accessible in a small part of the component tree because it's local state. You know that no other components are going to mess with it. With global state, if you want that same maintainability, you're going to have to enforce that maintainability and good practice on your own time. But that's just more mental overhead. That's just more effort, right? You're not getting that promise of only a few components are working on the state and no other components are ever going to touch it that you get with local state that creates that guaranteed modularity. So the modularity alone is a really, really big deal. As your application grows larger and larger, the more modular it is, the easier it's going to be to deal with, right? If it's not modular, it's going to get harder and harder to add features, to debug, and all of that stuff as it grows. But if it's modular, it's going to be more maintainable. And as it grows, it's not going to just continually get more and more difficult to deal with it, to debug it, to extend it, and to overall just have good maintainability with it, right? So, yeah, the second big advantage we're going to talk about is just component reuse. Component reuse is one of the most important concepts in React. It's what makes React so great. It's one of the things that makes React so great is that we can reuse components easily. Well, when we use a global store, we actually can't reuse them that easily, right? Because the component is not just a component anymore, it's a component tied to a global store. You take that global store away. On the other hand, with local state, you can easily reuse any component without changing any code that's outside of the component tree, right? So with the global state, you're having to set up a new store anytime you create a new component that uses some global store. With the local state, you can just like copy and paste the component. You can just create a new instance of the component and it's going to handle creating that state on its own, right? Because local state's tied to the component's lifecycle itself. It's going to get initialized when the component first mounts and thrown away when the component dies. Point is, you get better component reuse with local state. It's easier to reuse components with less effort with local state than with global state. That's for sure. So I could talk about this all day, all week, or probably all year, even because there is so much to say about state management in React. It's one of the biggest concepts, it's one of the most important concepts. It's something you want to probably spend a lot of time thinking about and refining for yourself so that you can get it right and figure out what's going to work best for you and your React applications. So, just to summarize the stuff we just went over, we get better modularity with local state. We know that our complexity of any state management is going to be contained within a smaller subsection of the application. And with global state, we do not get that guarantee whatsoever, right? Any component can access the state, any component can change the state, any component can break the state. And if you use good design, that's less of an issue, but that is more mental overhead that we have to deal with global state that we do not have with local state. And yeah, like I just said, also we get better component reuse, which again is like the heart of React. So why would we throw that away if we don't have to? And I didn't touch on this at all, but there is definitely a time and place to use global state. I use global state all of the time. It's actually completely necessary to use global state if you have two components that aren't closely related on a component tree in like a larger application, because there's just no way to have them communicate with each other, to operate on the same state, to read and write from it without having some sort of global state management library. So that's when it's completely necessary. But I'll use it in times when it's not completely necessary as well, right? Because global state management libraries often come with cool features that help with certain types of state management. Like in Zustin and Redux, we have a persistence middleware. That's pretty nice to use. So sometimes I'll use a global state management library for things like that as well, just to take advantage of some of the extra features they provide. But If something can fit into local state and it fits the problem, I will always default to local state because we get that modularity, we get that component reuse, we get less mental overhead. So, yeah, that's all I got for today. If after all of this, you're still thinking, I'm just going to use global state for everything, it's just way easier for me to access the state from any component I want to access it from. I'm just going to keep using it. Well, that's totally fine, but at least you now know what the advantages of local state are. And if you have some other reason that you like using global state over local state in every situation, or you just don't like using local state much at all, I'd love to hear about that in the comments. Really appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. This has been React Magic.
React Magic. React Magic. React Magic.